when you write code once, but it can get read dozens or hundreds of times, not just by code reviewers, but by you too. Because if you make your code readable, you're going to come back to it later that day, later that week, later that month. AI is transforming how we write code. Fundamentals of good software design haven't changed. Master the basics, use AI to enhance them. Be a lifelong learner. That's the most important way you can become a senior developer and become highly skilled with AI. One of the core skills as a senior developer is learning. You will need to be able to pick up new technology quickly, because the one thing you know.
Ever wondered how coding can be both effective and enjoyable? Well, today's guest, Andrew Stellman, brings over 25 years of experience in software development, project management, and leading teams. He is the author of multiple best-selling O'Reilly books, including Head First C#, Beautiful Teams, Learning Agile, and Head First PMP. Andrew has a unique ability to make complex programming concepts accessible, helping developers at all levels build confidence and grow their skills. His hands-on, approachable teaching style has guided tens of thousands to achieve new heights in their careers. We are thrilled to have him here to share his insights and stories. Welcome, Andrew. With AI tools like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT becoming part of everyday coding, how do you see the role of fundamental programming skills evolving?
That's a great question. So first of all, thanks for having me. AI tools like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT, they're amazing, right? Not just at speeding up repetitive tasks, but also at actually writing code. But they depend on really solid programming skills, because without a strong foundation, the output can actually lead to confusion rather than solutions. There's this kind of misconception, right? There's been so much hype, so much talk of, we're going to get rid of all the developers, and that's crazy. It's kind of like the introduction of power tools didn't get rid of all the carpenters. It's just the opposite, made carpenters better and more effective. And AI is really similar. But what it means is writing maintainable and understandable code is more important than ever. AI is great at suggesting code, and it can suggest a lot of code, so much code. It could give you, you ask it the same prompt 10 times, and it'll give you 10 different solutions to it, and most of them will probably work. It's up to the developers to make sure it fits seamlessly into the system. AI changes the game, but it doesn't eliminate the need for problem-solving skills. And a big part of this is because AI often generates code that's almost right, but you need to make it work. It's your job as a developer to make it work. AI doesn't make you a better coder by yourself. It amplifies what you already know. If you have gaps in your knowledge, AI will magnify those gaps too. There's one thing we all know about AI now, is that it hallucinates, right? You ask it a question, ask it about a fact, it'll make things up. I was doing research for a recent O'Reilly training course that I was running on AI and prompting skills for developers. And the last page of the deck was just a further research page, books that you could recommend. And I asked it for books, and it gave me a list of books that didn't exist at all, from real authors that I knew, and that totally didn't write those books. It just made them up, and it'll do that with code too. If there's one message that I want to send to people about working with AI, it's about how you actually make your code base a mess. When you're building a house, the most destructive thing you can do is take a sledgehammer and knock down a wall. But that's not a destructive thing in code, because you could just go back to your Git repository and get the code you just deleted. Like, deleting code isn't destructive. What's really destructive is adding code and then adding more code on top of that. That's not great. And then adding more code on top of that, more code on top of that. We've all been there, where you've got this mess of dependencies upon dependencies upon dependencies, where pretty soon you're working with it and, it's just your brain hurts. You try to change, make one change and then make another change and another change. But you can't do that until this other change you can't make that change to another. It's this frenetic problem that AI can make really, really worse, because AI can generate all that code for you. And so the a really important fundamental programming skill is evaluating code. Think critically about what code works, what doesn't, and how to improve the suggestions that AI makes for you.
How can developers use AI to support their learning, especially when it comes to understanding challenging concepts? What advice would you give for using AI as a tool to enhance foundational knowledge, and what pitfalls should they avoid?
It's a really good question. And that's a problem I've been working on for a long time. In writing my book, Head First C#, was one of the books I've written for O'Reilly. Senior developers constantly learn new technology, right? Like, I've been writing code for decades, more than 3 decades. And this technology I'm working with today is very different than technology I was working with even 2 or 3 years ago. Certainly different than 5, 10, or 15 years ago. Technology changes constantly. And so one of the core skills as a senior developer is learning. You need to be able to pick up new technology quickly, because the one thing you know about what you're going to be doing next is it's different than what you're going to be doing today. And AI is actually a great learning tool for senior developers. And I always start, when we talk about things like using AI for learning challenging concepts, I always start from the senior developer perspective, partially because that's my own perspective, but partially because it's always easy. It's easier when you've got a lot of knowledge and got a broad base. And AI is great for seniors, because one of the hardest parts about learning new technology is following the correct patterns, the patterns that you're supposed to work with when we work with technology. Here's an example. I spent several years leading a team of Scala developers. Scala uses the same kind of stack as Java, the same JVM stack. And what we would typically hard to find really, really good Scala developers on the market, at least at that time. So we ended up getting a lot of new Java developers who are really good, but they kind of wrote Scala code like a Java developer. And it took them time to really adopt the patterns. Like, for example, learning to use options instead of nulls. And it took them a while to really, you have to write code and you read about something, but you didn't really get it until you wrote it yourself. And then you saw the examples and something clicked, you got that aha moment. AI is really, really good at short-circuiting that learning path, because AI is a pattern recognition tool, at least the way the LLM-based AIs are today. They have these giant, huge, unfathomably huge databases of code and text that they use for training. And they're really, really good at following patterns. They're pattern matchers. And your job as a senior developer is to pick up those patterns. So when you see the AI generate code for you, it immediately shows you kind of the right way to do it, the right way, in this case, to write Scala code. I wish we had AI back then. Here's the problem. That's great for seniors, but junior developers, it causes problems. For example, we just talked about how AI can hallucinate code, and they don't know enough to fix and see the problems. AI is great at generating a lot of code. A failure mode I've seen for a lot of junior developers is just taking that, pasting it straight into the app and straight into whatever their code base is. And that's why what I've really concentrated on is teaching them about using AI as a learning tool itself. And I've created a learning path. This is part of the research I did for the most recent edition of Head First C#. Came out a few months ago, and we're just going to the second printing now. The learning path starts with ask it questions. use it as a learning tool, use it as a research tool. And only after you've gotten the basics of prompt engineering, then you can go and start actually using it to generate code, because you start to understand where it can and can't, its limitations, what it can do for you, can't do for you. But as a learning tool, it's fantastic. Instead of asking for it to generate code to solve your problem, asking it to generate examples, asking it more questions, having a tool that you can ask follow-up questions to, that's read all the manuals, that can adapt to your learning style, because everybody has a different learning style. That's really, really valuable. One really important thing I keep coming back to every time I'm teaching about AI is avoid using it as your sole tool. In this case, if you're talking about learning challenging concepts, avoid using it as your sole teacher. Pair it with other resources. Read books, tutorials, videos, whatever, hands-on stuff, and then get into it and code yourself. Really understand the concepts. And the analogy I like to make is, if you only ever rely on your car's GPS for driving, you don't get a nearly as good a sense of direction and your neighborhood and how to get around your city, as if you kind of pick a destination and learn how to get there yourself. And you can actually test this out yourself in video games. Take your favorite, open world game that has driving in it, and instead of relying on the GPS, like the pathfinding system, to tell you the route, figure it out yourself, and do that for an hour, and you will learn the maps in the game so much better than if you just relied on the built-in pathfinding tools. And AI, there's a great way to make sure you've got the direction for your AI. Don't have the AI GPS on all the time. Use your own thinking skills to pick your path through the learning.
Absolutely. That's a good analogy. I love the way you explained. You have discussed how AI can actually hold back new developers when they can't recognize its mistakes. How can beginners avoid this trap? What skills do they need to develop first to use AI effectively as a learning tool?
Oh man, that's a great question. So, new developers often struggle with AI because they don't fully understand the code that it generates. So, the first thing you need to do is start by carefully reading and understanding the code. And that gets to a really core development skill, because all of this, using AI effectively, always comes down to your core developer skills. I recently gave a talk, Fast Track Your Path to Senior C# Developer, and I identified just some 3 core skills that you need, and one of them is readability. There's a fantastic book also by O'Reilly, the same publisher that publishes my book, called Software Engineering at Google, and it talks all about how they do software engineering at one of the premier software engineering companies in the world. And they have a really interesting set of practices around readability, where they have readability leads whose senior people whose job is to do code reviews for readability specifically. And the reason is, when you write code once, but it can get read dozens or hundreds of times, not just by code reviewers, but by you too. Because if you make your code readable, you're going to come back to it later that day, later that week, later that month, and work with it. If your code is difficult to read, you've just left yourself a challenge for the future. And code readability skills are critical for when you're working with AI. Luckily for developers, they're also critical for ramping yourself up to get from, say, junior or intermediate developer to senior developer. It's a core skill. And it's also one that you can learn early. We teach basic readability and important core readability skills and refactoring skills, which is part of readability, in Head for C# from the very beginning of the book. Because it's one of those things that people kind of assume is something you need to be a senior developer to understand, but it's actually a core skill that you can work on from day one. And when you take the code that comes out of AI, if you're already in the habit of making your code readable and refactoring your code, so when you type in code, the first thing you think is, okay, how do I refactor this to make it more readable in the future? If that's something you do immediately, well, you're already in the habit of that. You're going to do that for the code that comes out of the AI too. When AI generates a class for you, you'll immediately look at it and say, is this class easy to read, easy to understand? You might tell it right then and there, okay, regenerate that, make it more readable. You could give it corrections or you could edit it yourself. That will make a huge difference, and that'll avoid a ton of pitfalls. Debugging skills are also essential to identifying when AI-generated code is flawed. And debugging is one of those things that takes practice. That was actually one of the first challenges back 15 years ago when we were writing the first edition of Head C#. Realizing people don't teach developers how to debug. And that's one of the things I've really put a lot of work into, teaching you core debugging skills, stepping through your code, adding watches, understanding what you're looking at stack traces. The reason is because that's also a great comprehension skill to understand what all the code that AI generates for you. It also helps you develop that habit of questioning everything AI generates. So, it ensures that you don't just blindly implement code that could have bugs or core design problems. It's funny. I recently had we're talking about how new developers can avoid AI pitfalls, and I recently had a really interesting experience. I was watching somebody, it was working on a Java Spring Boot app, and there was a bug in one of these, had to do with one of the annotations in one of the controllers. And he basically asked, it was working with GitHub Copilot, and he asked that fix my bug. And he found like 10 different ways to ask Copilot basically fix the bug, but he didn't understand the bug. And so he wasn't able to articulate a prompt that would tell it to fix it. And it reminded me of that old developer joke, but there's a lot of truth to it. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And what that means is that your code, code doesn't inherently have, obviously if there's exceptions, if it breaks, fine, that means there's a bug. But a lot of times bugs are really the code does one thing, but we want it to do another thing. And if AI generated code that did that one thing, but we wanted it to do another thing, it might be because of a prompt, it might be because it hallucinated, it might be because it misunderstood. It's up to you as a developer, it's up to us to understand that and fix it. And that's why we have to focus on readable code, clean modular code, separation of concerns. AI is really good at refactoring, but you have to tell it what to refactor. I'm running a little experiment. If you follow me on Blue Sky, you can see my updates on it. A little experiment in AI generated code where I'm generating a little visualization, simulation of little cellular automata, a little fun little graphic thing, using only code generated by AI. I'm not typing any of it, just to see what it, and within just one or two iterations of it, already ran into problems. Specifically, it started I could see, just because I've been doing this for so long, I could see that this would be a problem in the future. One of those problems where it would lead to that code base that was really hard to work with because you keep making changes and it require other changes. It was building a piece of it that was way too big, too much intelligence in this one piece that should have been distributed elsewhere in the system. So I had to stop and tell it to refactor. I had to give it this refactoring prompt, really iterate on that prompt a dozen times because it was really hard to get it to refactor it correctly. And that required a combination of me being able to look at the output, judge it, evaluate it, and recognize what is and isn't readable, what is and isn't maintainable, and understand, really deeply understand separation of concerns. Again, these are all core tools, core skills, and concepts that junior developers can learn. And we teach them. I've worked really hard on finding paths to teach junior developers about these things. Again, that's been my 15-year journey of working on consecutive editions of Head C# has given me a lot of insight into this. And these are all the same exact skills that make you that level you up from junior to senior developer are the same skills that it takes to work with AI.
Could you share an example of challenging concepts you have worked on, making accessible, especially one that could benefit both beginners and more experienced developers? How can AI help simplify complex ideas?
So I was just talking about separation of concerns. And again, that's, it took me a long time to figure out how to, like, a really good way to teach that. And so I'll draw an example from Head for C#. Breaking down, we have a little app in there that's part of, like, it would be for calculating damage in a role-playing game, and we have them write a damage to a little app to calculate damage for a sword, where it rolls dice and this is flaming or magic, and then and generates the damage for that. And so if you're playing like a Dungeons and Dragons type role-playing game, you'd use this app there. And then we introduce arrow damage. So it's a similar class, but for calculating damage from an arrow rather than a sword. And their job is to pull out, look at those two, figure out what they have in common, and then pull the thing that's in common out into a separate, in this case, a base class. And it's a first step in really understanding this idea, where if you have a class that does too many things, separate it into smaller classes, because decoupled code is easier to maintain and easier to understand and work with. And it's the idea of making challenging concepts accessible. Like, this is a great concept that AI can help reinforce. And in fact, one of the AI projects that we have them do, a little AI exercises, is take exactly that problem, feed exactly that to the same exact exercise we gave it, we gave the reader, give that same exact exercise to an AI, paste in the exercise, paste in the code as a prompt, and see how good a job it does at doing that refactoring. Because that's a great way to learn. It's a great way for AI to make a challenging concept more accessible, to see it solve the problem too. Formulating the question for it is a really good way to learn, because it turns out that prompt engineering is actually really, really similar to writing exercises for something. And one of the things that we do in our book is give people a ton of practice, coding practice. Like, there's exercises, dozens of exercises throughout the book, a lot of coding, because coding's a skill, and it really doesn't get into your brain until you start actually typing at a keyboard and writing your own code. Well, prompt engineering is a skill too, and giving people practice it is a skill. But what's really interesting is prompt engineering is really similar to writing an exercise for a beginner. In the first edition of Head for C#, we had an exercise that I didn't do a great job of writing the instructions for, and we got a lot of reader feedback saying, I need help with this. I fixed it in an early printing because it was just really hard to understand the instructions. And that's exactly the problem you get with AI, with prompt engineering. Like, you write bad instructions, it doesn't know how to follow them. And that's this is exactly the same way I had to spend years learning how to create exercises that people could solve, because it's a challenge, right? Create an exercise in a book where someone will build a solution that comes close to matching your code, because there's a million ways to solve any problem. Like, it took a lot of work and a lot of practice. And so one of the things I recommend and I try to give people is practice with prompt engineering. For experienced developers, AI can scaffold complex designs. Like, they can suggest great architectural patterns. You still need to evaluate where those patterns fit your specific needs. For junior developers, it can do the same thing, but you can use it to understand those patterns and ask it. As a senior developer, one of the advantages you have is you've got a ton of experience. You immediately recognize these patterns. You immediately recognize the design patterns. But for a junior developer, you finally have this thing you can actually sit there and ask it. You can ask it questions and it will give you answers. It will, it'll tell you this is a flyweight design. This is a singleton pattern. This is publisher, pub sub or observer. And it'll give you more information about it. This is such a great tool for making challenging concepts accessible. And this is why when I was working on my learning path for AI for new developers, what I was really concentrating on was using it as a learning tool, because if you it gives you immediate benefit. You immediately start ramping up your learning path. You immediately start flattening out those learning curves. But at the same time, you work on those critical prompt engineering skills. And I really believe that when you treat it that way, like if you treat AI as just a code generating machine where it writes code for you, you paste it into your code base and you're suddenly a super fast developer, that's not going to work. You're going to end up with that mess. You're going to make that unmaintainable code base we've been talking about. But if you treat it as a learning tool for ramping up your own skills, and doing things like you write code and then you paste it in and say, evaluate this code. Does this match what you were telling me? It'll tell you. It's actually really good at reading your code. If you use GitHub Copilot and you do /explain, it'll explain the code really well for you. Paste in code into any AI and tell it, explain this code. It'll give you a good explanation. Generally pretty solid, which makes sense because, like I mentioned earlier, these AIs are built from training databases of unfathomable amounts of code. And a lot of that code includes explanations. It recognizes patterns. It'll see one set of comments or something in documentation and connect those dots really easily for you, and use that in its explanation. And that's a great way to sort of blend. When you blend those capabilities of AI with your judgment, you work on readability, you work on critical thinking skills, it will help you simplify rather than over-engineer your code. And that I feel like that's the core to making challenging concepts accessible with AI.
You recently finished the 5th edition of Head First C#. How has the rise of AI tools influenced your approach to teaching C#, and what unique challenges or opportunities does AI present, especially for developers learning the language?
There were a lot of challenges in building our learning path for AI. What I did was I ended up developing a set of elements called Sense AI, based on a sort of a play on the word sensei, the Japanese word for a sort of teacher, instructor. And one of the first sort of unique challenges that I ran into was finding that balance of AI and traditional programming skills. Because I wanted to teach AI as a tool, but I knew that the most important part of working with AI is helping people build up their fundamental development skills. And I knew there's a danger that new developers would kind of get frustrated. They see this tool that can generate code for them. Why do I have to learn all this stuff? Especially, learning development is all about running into a roadblock, working with it, and then you get that aha moment, and suddenly, oh, I get it, and you move past it. And it's just a series of these aha moments. And part of my challenge, just in teaching in general, is helping people get to those aha moments as quickly as possible. I wanted to get AI into developers' hands immediately, but I knew that using AI-generated code from the beginning would actually be counterproductive, because they would just immediately start using that code and not really reading it because they hadn't built up those code comprehension skills yet. So I knew that I needed to give them something to work with that was satisfying, that they felt that they were learning, that I could give you. So if you're on your learning path for AI, as in parallel with your learning path for development, I want to give you something that you can use today so that you're getting value out of it, but that doesn't short circuit your core development learning, which is what you really need to be the most effective AI developer you can be. So I developed a series of exercises to show how AI fits into a real world development workflow. And that's what I was really my focus here is helping people become those senior developers that they can be. And these exercises, we have them build both coding and AI guidance skills simultaneously, especially ones focused on learning. When I was writing the Sense AI sections in Head for C#, one of the very first things I did was I emphasized this idea of trust but verify, because like we talked about, AIs hallucinate and they just get things wrong all the time. That's a real challenge for people, because not just having a computer tell you a thing, but an AI, it's supposed to, they say these things so confidently, it's like, I like to say it's the greatest BS artist in the world, because it will tell you things that are 100% wrong, but phrase it in a way that it sounds like it's a perfect answer. And actually, it's a really good example I give people in the very beginning. In the second chapter of the book, so this is a book that you could pick up this book with no programming experience, and it'll actually teach you how to be a developer. Give you a ton of skills. That's why it's a long book. And in the second chapter, we're talking about loops, and there's an exercise, it's a pencil and paper exercise where we give them a set of loops, and we ask them how many times does this loop iterate? How many times does it go through the loop? And I've never had a reader send me a question about it and ask, hey, I don't know how this works. Like, it's something that readers are able to get, even ones who've never really done a lot of coding before. So I took that exact same question, phrased exactly the same way we asked a reader, and asked Copilot, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, every AI I could get my hands on, and over and over again asked the same question. Not only would they get it wrong, but I never once had an AI get that question right. And I give that to that. I put that really early in the AI learning path, because it reinforces this basic idea that you have to trust but verify. What it comes out, what it gives you is probably right, but not necessarily, because you've now seen it be wrong about something was right. That's also why I mentioned earlier that exercise where they put in, they literally copy and paste the exercise they solved already themselves. They can look at the solution it gives and evaluate it. Did it do the same thing you did? Did it get everything right? It could get it wrong. Teaching C# with AI, side by side, it opened up really interesting new opportunities for experimentation. Learners can explore alternative approaches quickly, but I need to make sure they have the skills to refine and test what AI generates. Now, lucky for me as an educator and a writer and author, but lucky for the rest of us, everybody who wants to become a better developer, those are the same exact skills that you need to go from junior to senior developer. That's why it was a really interesting challenge coming up with a really solid learning path for AI. And I think I've done a pretty effective job of giving people that side-by-side AI and core development skill learning.
I've read your book, and it does a fantastic job in terms of making it easy for beginners to understand the concept. So I pretty much recommend this for everyone who is getting into their first orbit or second orbit of programming, wherever they are. This is definitely a great concept or way to explain the concept. So that's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny. One of the most satisfying parts of my career is I will hear back from people who now that the book, since the first edition came out 15 years ago, and so now there are people who are senior engineers who used my book to learn. Like one of the tech reviewers for the 5th edition was somebody who used it to learn and became a senior engineer and coding streamer. I got an email from somebody I sent a copy to maybe years ago, and he came back to me and said, "Hey, that book you sent me now I am a senior developer and a team lead at a company, leading my own team of developers. Just giving people those core skills to launch their careers has been so satisfying. And that's why it was so important to me to make sure we had a solid AI learning path.
It is a springboard. Yeah, it is a springboard for all of us. We love that book. Any final advice for developers on balancing AI assistance with hands-on learning and critical thinking, particularly for those aiming to grow their skills and careers?
Okay, so practical advice. Well, when we're talking about AI, practical advice is going to be, honestly, about your prompt engineering skills, especially for accurate AI output. And so the first most practical piece of practical advice I can give you is, be as specific as possible in your prompts. Instead of asking, how do I fix this bug? You provide, detailed context. So, about the problem, the expected behavior. There's no such thing as too much information. AIs are great at picking up on context clues. Give them as much context as you can. Not just about the code, but also about the problem. They'll guess a lot of things from things like naming, the way you name your variables and methods. It can connect the dots with the problem statements that you work with. Like if you're building if you've got a bug in a system to, fix a flow valve in an engine, in a sewage system, tell it, don't just say, here's the code for it. Say, this is the flow valve in a sewage system. It has to get water from here to there. And here's the technical engineering challenges. All of that is information because it could pull something useful from all of that. Iteration. It's funny. The Agile revolution happened 20 years ago now. And we are in a world where people are used to the idea of iterative development. We all work with things like, Scrum and sprints. And even if your team doesn't do that now, you've worked with teams that have. Well, AI is the same way. Use iterative prompts. Iterate on it. The output it gives you can be improved. You can start over. You can always, it's not going to judge you for asking the same question 10 times in slightly different ways. Start with a broad question, analyze its output, and narrow it down with follow-ups. What underlies all of this is that prompt engineering is a skill. Practice writing prompts regularly, because just like coding is a skill that gets better with practicing coding, prompt engineering is a skill that gets better. You get better at it with practice and prompt engineering. The more you experiment with AI, the better you'll understand how to phrase questions for the best results. And it's funny, other core development skills translate really, really well to prompt engineering skills, breaking them down into smaller steps. Like the way we have to break our programming problems down into smaller steps. And again, that's one of those skills that we sometimes feel like that's more of a senior thing, but I teach that in Head for C# from the very first chapter, taking a bigger project and breaking it down. Same exact thing goes into prompts. Like instead of asking all at once, figure out how to break it down. You could even ask it, I need to solve this problem. How do we want to break it down step by step? It'll give you suggestions. They might not be the ones you want to do, but it's a really good starting point. You can iterate on that. Test your code. AI is really good at generating unit tests too. Debug your AI generated code. Although again, you can generate too many tests. And there's some developers who fall into the pitfall of wanting to go from 98% code coverage to 100% code coverage. It requires you to write a whole bunch of extra tests whose entire job is just to test the code. And then you end up having code that's harder to change because when you want to make one change, you have to suddenly make changes to all these tests that don't really make any sense and don't need to be there. It's really easy to ask AI to generate a whole bunch of extra tests. So, that's another one of those balance skills that comes with practice. But you can get it to generate tests for you, test your code. It'll help you refactor. Again, I'm listing out core development skills that I've been teaching people for years, and they apply really well to helping you learn and ramp up on AI.
This is fantastic, Andrew. We now we understand how things are coming together when we see a programming language which is coupled with AI capabilities. How do you see future, and are you going to come up with any other additional books which we can kind of keep looking for?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question too. So my plan right now is all about finding ways to balance AI with hands-on learning. And I'm really experimenting with that. I trying to find ideas and concepts and approaches that resonate with people. And actually, I'm using social media a lot as a way to experiment with this. I have a large following on LinkedIn. I'm posting a lot there, and on Blue Sky, and spending a lot of time talking, trying to find things that resonate with people. And for viewers, I'd love your feedback. If you if something works for you, I would love to know. Because AI is a great learning tool, but you need it to supplement and not replace your learning. One of the things that I'm trying to teach people is that AI gives you a safe space for exploring. It's funny, we almost treat these things as if they're people, and sometimes even get a little embarrassed asking the same question over and over again and asking too many follow-up questions. It's not a person. It doesn't judge you. It can't think. It doesn't understand. It's a pattern matcher. At least the current generation of AIs are. So you have a safe space to explore. But I also, balancing it with real hands-on learning, a lot of that's about cultivating critical thinking. That's the key to balancing AI. Question your assumptions, test your solutions, and look for ways to simplify or improve all the code that AI generates. A big piece of it that I want to focus on going forward, and one of the things I'm planning on doing is working on. I'm hoping, possibly writing, but definitely a set of videos about some of these core skills, especially the kind of skills that both help you ramp up to senior developer and also help you ramp up your AI skills, like your readability skills, being able to write readable code, refactoring skills to make your code more readable, helping you build the habits of revisiting and refining your code. Because if you build that habit when you're writing a code, then you'll automatically do it when you get code that the AI generates. Because AI might give you that first draft, but it's up to you to polish it and finish it and make sure it actually works. I think the one biggest takeaway that I feel like I can give people is always focus on the problem that you're solving. Development in general is a set of skills: coding skills, AI skills, reading skills, refactoring skills, architecture, testing. These are all your project management. These are all related, and I've touched on all of those today. But they only work when you have a deep understanding of the problem you're solving. That's why one of the first innovations I mentioned Agile. One of the first innovations of the Agile world that introduced 20 something years ago was this idea of a product owner, person whose job it is to understand the problem that team is trying to solve and help when working correct. When an Agile team works well, that person helps the team understand and learn about that problem. The more you can understand the problems you're solving, the better code you will write. And that's actually difficult for a lot of developers, because we love to sometimes think of ourselves as writing code in isolation, like go into a dark room for a weekend and write out code, and it's just, nothing we do is disconnected. Everything we do is for solving a problem. And that is so important with AI, because as you start losing track of the problem you're solving, and especially as your prompts start deviating from that problem, the code you get will be more and more generic and less applicable to the code base that you're building out. I think that if you work on those skills, and my job is going to be to help you. That's what I'm focused on in the near future. Help you learn those skills. That is the key to staying current, staying relevant, and using AI to leverage yourself up into a senior developer position.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. This was very, very informative, and there are a lot of areas which you delve into. I would certainly expect my audience to also deep dive further and see what are the real possibilities. This is very, very useful, especially to the audience that we are catering to. I would like to thank you on everybody's behalf, and there is a lot that I have learned today, and happy learning, and thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much.
Hope you enjoyed watching this episode. But this is not all. There is more to come. A special mention to why involve network followers for writing to us and suggesting some interesting topics. This is very encouraging and makes us do a lot more. Keep watching and stay tuned. Thank you.